A former football player returns home to watch a homecoming game and introduce his lover to his family, unaware that an encounter with his ex-girlfriend will change their lives forever. One late evening on a dark, snowy road, a broken-hearted woman named Shelby cries while driving her truck. She almost crashes into an approaching vehicle and avoids it just in time. Dropping her cigarette, she crouches to pick it up, but upon looking ahead, a woman appears out of nowhere, blocking the road and calling out to her. She steers away from the woman as much as possible, and a loud crash echoes in the night. That day in Mount Bliss City, Shelby smoked while waiting for her two tardy employees. Despite reminding them about the bustling bowling alley during the homecoming season, they quickly donned their uniforms and went to work. Meanwhile, at a university, Elizabeth, a student, picked up her boyfriend Mike. As they greeted each other sweetly, the boyfriend noticed his lover's hidden anxiety and gently probed about it. Elizabeth confessed she was worried about meeting his parents because she wanted to make an excellent first impression. They're about to drive away, but Eddie, Elizabeth's ex-boyfriend, suddenly halts them. Despite having Mike in the car, he deliberately and repeatedly invited Elizabeth to various events over the weekend, which the woman clearly but politely refused. On the other hand, at Mount Bliss City, Shelby was approached by Lloyd, a bank debt collector in her bowling alley. She tried to brush him off, but the man professionally emphasized that the bank needed to see some progress with her loans. Due to this, Shelby promised to drop by the bank the next day, which Lloyd reiterated should be kept this time. Simultaneously, Mike ranted to Elizabeth about Eddie, which opened the topic of former lovers. When the girlfriend asked about Shelby, Mike dismissed it as almost completely forgotten. At the bowling alley, Billy, Mike's police cousin, swung by and chatted with Shelby. Upon mentioning his cousin's arrival, the woman expressed her excitement to meet her lover again. Surprised, Billy verified Shelby and Mike split, yet she explained they were taking a break for him to concentrate on college. So the officer joked about Shelby's awesomeness before leaving. Afterward, the homecoming game commenced, and the couple, Mike and Elizabeth, finally arrived. They were welcomed by Billy, who recited the woman's personal information, noting that he had to know her identity to ensure Mike's safety. Elizabeth brushed it off as a joke, and Billy commented about her pleasing appearance. Then, the cop warned his cousin about Shelby since the woman thought they were still a couple. Mike replied that Shelby was playing a joke, but Billy clarified that the woman kept talking about him and seemed really serious about her beliefs. When the game ends, the cop asks Mike if they'll have another round of drinks. Elizabeth immediately agreed, dismissing her boyfriend's reluctance. Once alone in the car, Mike remains incredibly quiet, so his girlfriend probed about his behavior. He admitted Shelby owned the bowling alley, and Billy said the woman assumed they were still an item. Elizabeth inquired why, and Mike said they hadn't spoken since he left. His girlfriend found it creepy but dismissed it as a lingering attachment, assuring Mike she could handle it. Arriving at the alley, a staff member greeted Mike cheerfully, mentioning Shelby's fond talk of him. Noticing Elizabeth, she gave a cold greeting, instructing him to meet the boss. Laughing, Elizabeth encouraged him to talk to Shelby as she stayed with Billy. Mike called Shelby from the stockroom, only to be greeted with a passionate kiss. He reminded her of their breakup after he departed for college, but Shelby revealed plans for a family home extension. Mike firmly clarified his current relationship, pushing her away. He left her bewildered and rushed to Elizabeth to urge her to leave. Shelby suddenly interjected and warmly praised the newcomer's appearance, which surprised Mike while Billy remained observant. This gave Elizabeth a good impression of Shelby, so when the establishment owner invited her for some drinks, she immediately accepted. The ex-girlfriend cleared the air between them by declaring that her relationship with Mike was in the past, which Elizabeth was glad to hear. Billy and Mike watched them from afar with relief upon seeing the women having a good time. Hours later, the establishment closes. Elizabeth mentioned to Shelby that the time to meet Mike's parents for the first time had finally come. The ex-girlfriend showed an expression that made Elizabeth curious, so she probed about the sudden change. Shelby told her that Mike's parents are very particular with first impressions, so she advised the current girlfriend to hide her drunkenness. She jokingly emphasized that she was Mike's girlfriend for 3 years, but Elizabeth cheerfully retorted that they were kids then, which caused Shelby's face to turn serious. Elizabeth immediately apologized for offending her, but after a brief pause, the ex-girlfriend laughed out loud, relieving the tension. As they all left the establishment, Mike mentioned the long-awaited meet and greet with his parents. However, his girlfriend refused to come with him to avoid creating a negative first impression based on Shelby's story. The boyfriend boyfriend argued that her drunken state didn't matter, but Elizabeth insisted on spending the night in a motel. Billy volunteered to send her there, and Mike finally agreed. They all left, unaware of Shelby's broken state. Soon, Billy dropped Elizabeth off at the closest motel with a vacancy sign posted. Unfortunately, the establishment owner told the woman that there was no vacancy for the night and the sign was just broken. Elizabeth checked for Billy, but he had already left, so she asks the owner for the closest hotel, which is 4 miles away. She tried to look for a phone reception but failed. At the same time, the hotel owner locked the door, disregarding her continuous knocks. Meanwhile, Mike finally arrived at his house, and Mrs. Donaldson, his mom, excitedly welcomed him. She asked about her son's girlfriend, so Mike explained her drunken state. His mom brushed it off, and the son commented that he was explaining to Elizabeth that her condition didn't matter to them, but she insisted on composing herself before appearing. On the other hand, the girlfriend walked down the cold and dark road with her luggage. Simultaneously, Shelby was driving recklessly as she was preoccupied with the current turn of events with her beloved. Coincidentally, Elizabeth saw a car approaching and blocked the road to hitch a ride, unaware that the driver was the unstable Shelby. The ex-girlfriend noticed her too late as she tried to avoid the person who suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Shelby frantically went down her truck to check on the person and was shocked to see that she had hit Elizabeth, so she dragged the unconscious woman. At present, Mike notices his pictures with Shelby posted on the walls in his room, so he removes them. He calls his girlfriend the following day, but there's no response, so he leaves voice messages. Meanwhile, Shelby enters a room in her house and checks Elizabeth's condition, lying unconscious on the bed while an IV drip is attached to her. She curiously inspects her injuries and changes the IV like it's the most natural thing to do. On the other hand, Billy convinces Mike to go fishing with him, especially since Elizabeth is still asleep in the hotel. With Mr. Donaldson, Mike's father, siding with his nephew, the man finally agrees. As Elizabeth wakes up, Shelby greets her, recounting the previous night and how she too was abandoned by Mike. Claiming credit for saving Elizabeth's life, she mentions using her late mother's medical supplies on her. Deliberately touching the injured foot, Shelby induces sobs from the woman and falsely assures her she's contacted Mike, who hasn't responded. Injecting a sedative, she lulls Elizabeth to sleep. Meanwhile, Mike tries to reach her, while Billy advises him to be patient. Because of this, the cousin relays the value of his current relationship versus his past one with Shelby. Meanwhile, the ex-girlfriend returns to the bowling alley. She enters Elizabeth's car and opens her phone. Her eyes spark with jealousy upon seeing another sweet message from Mike. At the same time, Elizabeth finally wakes up alone in Shelby's house. Hours later, Billy drops Mike off at the hotel where he left Elizabeth, only to discover she hasn't checked in. Jokingly, the cop suggests she might have fled, but Mike remains anxious. Dismissing his worry, Billy insists the town is safe. Meanwhile, despite her injuries, Elizabeth explores and stumbles upon Shelby's room, realizing the extent of her obsession with Mike through memorabilia and love notes plastered on the walls. Simultaneously, Shelby hides Elizabeth's car in a nearby warehouse but is alerted by noises, prompting her to return and feign ignorance. However, her act fails, leading to Shelby breaking her foot. While Elizabeth sobs in despair, Shelby locks her up. The obsessed woman notices the piles of bank bills delivered to her house. However, she disregards this and calls Mike to invite him for dinner. The man refuses her many times, but she remains insistent, so he finally agrees to meet for lunch. Mr. Donaldson assumes his son is torn between the women, so he offers him some drinks. Afterward, Shelby ensures to sedate her captive while she excitedly prepares to meet Mike. Later in the bowling alley, she comments that he hasn't changed. However, the man remains worried about Elizabeth, so Shelby plants seeds of doubt as she mentions the girlfriend talking about a former lover. Mike takes the bait, and the ex-girlfriend emphasizes that an old fire can rekindle, so the man hurriedly leaves while Shelby happily asks if he'll attend the homecoming event. That evening, Shelby wraps a bandage around Elizabeth's broken foot while zealously discussing her meeting with Mike at lunch. She brazenly apologizes for the freezing room while anticipating the homecoming night. Though Elizabeth cedes in anger, she remains composed and silent as Shelby sedates her again. Her eyes immediately close, and the abductor excitedly leaves. However, the moment she leaves the house, Elizabeth opens her determined eyes and throws away the unattached ivy line. She hurriedly trudges to the phone to call for help, but an axe greets her as the phone line gets chopped by Shelby. The obsessed woman yells at her captive for not appreciating everything she's done for her. Elizabeth states her wrongdoings, but this makes matters worse. Shelby declares that Mike calls his current lover selfish, and he is right. In fear, Elizabeth follows her abductor's command to return to her room. Once again, she is sedated. This time, duct tape wraps around her wrist to avoid detaching the ivy line. Then, Shelby opens Elizabeth's luggage. She touches the embroidery on the woman's bag and tries her perfume. She sees a box that contains a luxurious men's coat, which is Elizabeth's gift for Mike, so Shelby jealously takes it. On the other hand, Mike stays with Billy in the police station when he receives a message from Elizabeth saying that she returned to school because their relationship is progressing too quickly. This leaves a wrong impression on Billy, so he pushes his cousin to look at Shelby again since the current lover isn't worth it. Brokenhearted, Mike finally agrees to have fun with Billy and attend the homecoming celebration. Meanwhile, Shelby shows off to the disoriented Elizabeth her lingerie for tonight as she anticipates spending the night with Mike. Afterward, she arrives at the bar and alluringly walks before her former lover to get his attention. She charmingly and meaningfully glances at Mike multiple times before heading to the ladies' room to give him the cue. Moments later, the man follows her, unaware of Elizabeth's pitiful state. Mike gives in to the temptation and passionately kisses Shelby, who's more than willing to give herself to him. However, he notices their reflection in the mirror and stares at it while Elizabeth tries to escape the room. In the comfort room, Mike stops himself from going further with Shelby, mainly because he's drunk. The woman remarks that getting drunk is his benefit as he finally stops listening to his lover's craziness. Simultaneously, Elizabeth fails to open the window while Shelby adds salt to his wound by saying the other woman doesn't love him. The man walks away, leaving the woman sobbing in despair at rejection. The following day, Shelby brings food to Elizabeth and skillfully insults her weak state. She comments that the captive reminds her of her frail mother. Then, the abductor subconsciously opens up her hatred toward taking care of her mom, who also passed on her craziness, bitterness, and debts to her. Shelby tells Elizabeth that she can leave alone when she's better, but the doorbell rings, and the woman hits her captive unconscious. Lloyd greets her by the door and asks them to enter the house to talk. Shelby invites him in, and the man observes the messy house. Elizabeth wakes up and throws the food to create noise and get attention, but Shelby skillfully diverts Lloyd's attention while the captive notices her coat. Then he tells the woman that the bank has finally decided to take the bowling alley and the house, which frustrates the owner. Lloyd can only apologize before leaving. Elizabeth does her best to call him by yelling and thumping on the window. When she finally catches his attention, the curtains open, and Shelby waves at him through it, with the man utterly unaware that the captive has collapsed as the abductor steps on her neck to shut her off. Shelby blames Elizabeth for losing her business and house as she reasons that Lloyd notified the bank that she's lying about Mike being with her. The captive weakly declares that the woman can't control anything since her pain results from things she's desperately trying to hold on to. The ex-girlfriend becomes more upset and drags Elizabeth to lock her up in the bathroom while declaring how pathetic her captive is. Then, Shelby prepares herself to meet with Mike again. As she excitedly holds the luxurious coat she stole from Elizabeth, she realizes that there's something in its pocket, so she takes it and discovers a note written by her captive. She grabs it and throws it through the bathroom door's gap, leaving a condescending remark about Elizabeth's failed attempt to ask for help from Mike. The captive sobs in despair but tries to find ways to escape. Afterward, Shelby arrives at Mike's house. Despite the man's disinterest in being alone with her, she convinces him to come with her. Meanwhile, Elizabeth releases her wrists from the duct tape. She grabs the toilet tank lid to break an exit, but she notices papers attached to it. Upon opening the documents, she finds pictures of Shelby's mom and the hospital report stating she was probably poisoned. Due to the daughter's refusal to autopsy, the investigation was halted. On the other hand, Shelby gives Mike the coat she got from Elizabeth, and the man is genuinely pleased. The woman helps him to wear it and advances for a kiss, but this time, Mike bluntly tells her off. The confused woman mentioned the passionate night before, but the man firmly states that he only did it because he was drunk and there's nothing more. As he marches away, Shelby can't help but express her hatred towards her mom, whom she's blaming for not being able to come with Mike to college. Mike states his disappointment toward her outbursts, but upon seeing her cry, she hugs her. Later, he confesses everything to his cousin, who openly scolds him for trading Shelby with Elizabeth because the former lover is completely loyal. Upon returning home, Shelby is caught unprepared as Elizabeth hits her on the head with a toilet tank lid. The captive hurriedly grabs a parka and limps out of the house. She goes to the warehouse where her car is parked but can't open it. Frustrated, she hits the vehicle, causing the alarm to blare and Shelby to know her location. The abductor grabs the car key, which is in Elizabeth's parka, before grabbing her head. The captive wakes up a few moments later inside the basement with her wrists and feet tightly wrapped in duct tape while Shelby quietly sharpens the pliers. Enraged, she approaches Elizabeth as she defends herself for ending her mother's life. The captive screams echo as the deranged woman cuts her feet with the tool. That night, Shelby cries as she watches and rewinds video clips of her sweet life with Mike. The following day, Elizabeth remains unconscious with her bleeding ankles while Mike looks at his old pictures with Shelby. Then, he prepares himself for the final homecoming celebration as a former football player. His mom hands him the coat Shelby gave him, but he feels uncomfortable wearing it because of their awkward situation. Mrs. Donaldson disregards his concern, and the son gives in. On the other hand, Shelby glams herself up for the celebration, and Elizabeth wakes up. The doorbell rings, and the captive tries again to ask for help. While she crawls in her pitiful state, Shelby opens the door to Billy, who's volunteering to send her to the party. He enters the house and notices the woman's head injury. Shelby dismisses his concerns and urges him to leave, but Elizabeth manages to pull the electric fuse lever to get attention. Billy immediately volunteers to fix it, which Shelby frantically declines. However, the persistent cop enters the basement and soon finds Elizabeth. Before he can react, Shelby stabs him with an axe and grabs his gun. As she pulls the trigger, she realizes that the safety is on, so she hurriedly switches it off and ends Billy's life, with Elizabeth sobbing upon witnessing her wickedness. Shelby blames her again, and Elizabeth can only shake in fear as she approaches her. Afterward, Elizabeth sees how Shelby disposes of Billy's body by dumping it into the incinerator bin before burning it. Then, the deranged woman goes to the kitchen to eat a massive chunk of meat like nothing happened. In the homecoming celebration, the coach delivers his speech while Mike calms his nerves in the restroom. He removes his coat and fixes his clothes, but suddenly notices something on Shelby's gift. To see it clearly, he takes the sleeves and finally spots the embroidered initials of Elizabeth's name, which is typical for her things to have. When the coach calls in Mike for a speech, the man is nowhere to be found, as he sprints out of the venue while leaving a message to Billy about her hypothesis of Elizabeth being captured by Shelby. Mike musters all his strength to run on the snowy road to get to Shelby's house while the culprit enjoys eating the massive chunk of meat on her plate. Upon arriving at the house, Mike fails to notice Billy's shoes sticking out from the burning incinerator bin. He impatiently knocks on the door, and when Shelby opens it, he immediately enters to look for Elizabeth. The girlfriend screams with all her might despite being muffled, and Shelby confidently smiles as Mike detects the noise from the basement. He rushes in and releases his lover. However, Shelby approaches them with Billy's gun. Mike blocks his body to protect his lover and tries to reason out with his ex-girlfriend, but Shelby shoots him in the leg. Mike writhes in pain but tackles the attacker. She hits her head on the wall and loses consciousness. Mike grabs the gun and carries Elizabeth out of the basement. He frantically looks for something to cut the duct tape, but Shelby marches toward his lover with an axe while he's preoccupied. Elizabeth yells for help, and Mike tackles her again. Unfortunately, Shelby overpowers him this time and uses the axe handle to strangle him. Elizabeth spots a football helmet that fell from somewhere during the struggle, so she grabs it and hits her abductor's head. Mike escapes and catches his breath as his lover repeatedly hits Shelby with the helmet. The boyfriend stops Elizabeth from ending the woman's life, but Shelby moves to grab the gun. The girlfriend hurriedly grabs the helmet again and hits the perpetrator more until she faints for good. Elizabeth breaks down and cries her sorrows, and Mike embraces her. The girlfriend begs him to leave, and the man carries her while limping out of the house. Meanwhile, the unconscious Shelby dreams of her sweet prom night with Mike, and her eyes open widely.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.